As Masonic brothers, we are taught to pray to deity of our own individual faith on a daily basis. Now, I have no doubt that Brother George Washington did this, as he was a big believer in divine providence and a deeply religious man. It was September 1780 when Adjutant General John André was captured. He was captured right here in Tarrytown, New York, along the Hudson River, and not far from the childhood home of Colonel John Odell. Behind me is a statue commemorating this event, and we are near the area where John André was captured. He was intercepted by three gentlemen, a John Paulding, a David Williams, and an Isaac Van Wart. Now, 2 to 3 of these men would go on to become Masonic brothers, and one of whom would join Cortlandt Lodge No. 34. Now, Cortlandt Lodge No. 34 still exists to this day. They are part of the 1st Westchester Putnam District. And it was a chance meeting between this brother and one of the founding members of Cortlandt Lodge No. 34 that would save the day and illustrate why George Washington believed in divine providence. And you'll see why. I just want to say this. We make these videos and we don't get paid for them. We cover the expenses out of our own pocket, and we do it simply because we love our history. We love the history of Freemasonry. We especially love the history of this country, and we love to share it with you as well. So the only reward we get for making these videos is when we get comments and likes, and people share them, and we get fairly high view counts on the videos. Then we know people are watching them and they enjoy them. I can't tell you what it means to me when I read comments from our viewers. I just love reading them. Along those lines, Right Worshipful Gary Heinmiller, who is the Grand Historian for the state of New York, has done an astonishing amount of work. Now, that's also not a paid position. And much of this video was based on his PDF, The Capture of John André. He's been a tremendous resource for me in making these videos. And if you're a Mason in New York and you're into history and you don't know who this man is, you are missing the boat. You cannot believe the volume of work that this brother has done and his contribution to New York State Masonry. Today, when we think of cowboys, we think of either the Old West and gunfighters, or perhaps we think of rodeos or bull riding competitions. But generally we picture men wearing cowboy hats and chaps, riding horses and rustling cattle. Yet the first cowboys were actually from Westchester County. They were a notorious band of Tory soldiers who were based out of West Farm. I am in the West Farm section of the Bronx, in Bronx, New York. Directly behind me is the Bronx Zoo. So if you were walking here in the 18th century, this was all farmland. It's very far from farmland now, and if you would go beyond those gates back then, there was an important grist mill, and that grist mill was owned by Peter Delancey. Peter Delancey was Oliver Delancey's father. When his father, Peter, passed away, Oliver and his brother James inherited this property. Oliver Delancey's mother was born Alice Colden, and her father was Cadwallader Colden. Now, Cadwallader Colden served as governor in New York State in the 1760s, and he was a very integral part of the Delancey political machine. Now, the Delancey political machine had one big rivalry, and that was the Livingston family. Yes, the same Livingston family that Chancellor Robert R. Livingston came from. The Delanceys versus the Livingstons, the politics that bound these factions together bled into the American Revolution. A lot of the Delanceyites served on the Loyalist side, while most of the Livingston faction served on the American Continental side. Just imagine the pressure on Oliver Delancey. Almost his entire family were Loyalists, and they were beyond Loyalists. They were heavily involved in the Loyalist side. But it gets even closer to home. His brother James, who he owned the mill with here, became a colonel in the British Army, and he played a very pivotal role in the conflict. This group, the Cowboys in Westchester, were led by Colonel James Delancey. Now, poor Oliver Delancey, he had to be the black sheep of the family, because at the beginning of the war, he had been a lieutenant in the British Navy. He resigned his commission in the Navy because he did not want to fight against his neighbors. Think about his whole family, though. They were heavily Loyalist. His uncle was Major General Oliver Delancey, who was the highest ranking British officer serving during the American Revolution that had been born here. Oliver's son Oliver was also in the British Army, and here we have Oliver Delancey with his brother Colonel James Delancey, being a notorious man throughout Westchester County. And the Patriots constantly went out trying to locate Colonel James Delancey to arrest him, because he was just wreaking havoc throughout the county, stealing livestock and any kind of goods that he could scavenge for the British Army. And this is who the three gentlemen who are central to the story of the capture of John André set out to capture that fateful day when they actually captured John André instead. So I am standing in front of the Wick Homestead. Now, during the American Revolution, this was a supply depot, and this was actually George Washington's headquarters. On September 24th in 1780, George Washington met with our French allies in Hartford, Connecticut. Apparently the meeting did not go that well, and George Washington was a little bit down in the dumps, as we say today, after the meeting, and he decided he wanted to go visit the one who must not be named and his wife, Peggy Shippen. Now, George Washington had known Peggy since she was a little girl, and he considered the couple friends. All this would change over the next 24 hours as George Washington discovered the treason of the one who must not be named. Now, along the way from Hartford, Connecticut to Fishkill, George Washington ran into a French ambassador. He decided to spend the evening here. The next day, himself, Marquis de Lafayette, and Henry Knox, all three were Masonic brothers, started off on their way down to Garrison to visit the one who must not be named, and Peggy. We are in Garrison, New York. Directly across the river from us is West Point Military Academy. Now, in 1780, West Point was merely a fort, and it was overseen by the one who must not be named. Now, he made his headquarters here across the river in Garrison at the Robinson home. Now, the Robinsons had been Loyalists, and their home had been seized. Now, this was a fairly common practice during the American Revolution, and we will touch on it several times in future episodes. So when George Washington arrived at the one who must not be named's home here in Garrison, New York, he wasn't there. His wife was upstairs, Peggy Shipman, and the servant there said that she was indisposed at the moment and couldn't meet with George Washington. George Washington had been told that the one who must not be named had crossed the river to go to West Point. So George Washington crossed the river to find the one who must not be named. And when he got to West Point, he was greeted by Colonel John Lamb. Now, John Lamb, you may remember from a prior episode, he was one of the New York Sons of Liberty, and he is buried in Trinity Church, Wall Street's graveyard. Now, the one who must not be named was nowhere to be found. He was not at West Point. And at that point, I think George Washington realized something was up. So George Washington returned back to the Robinson home. You gotta realize that everyone there was probably under direct suspicion of treason after what was discovered. Eventually, I guess Shipman came down. George Washington did not suspect that she played any role in the treason. Now, it's well known today that she was friendly with John André, and some of the productions out there have taken quite a bit of Hollywood creative liberty and have implied that there was some sort of love triangle going on between Peggy Shipman, John André, and the one who must not be named. Real historians do not really put any credence into that. It's believed that John André was dating someone by the name of Peggy, but it was a different woman. In doing research into the Masonic brothers that played a role in the American Revolution, a few stand out. Specifically here in Westchester, a couple stand out. One of them has to be John Paulding. Now, John Paulding was made a Mason in Cortlandt Lodge No. 34, which is currently the oldest lodge in Westchester County. That lodge was formed in 1793, just a few years ahead of Huguenot Lodge. We are in the old Van Cortlandtville Cemetery, not far from Peekskill, New York. Directly behind me is a monument that was erected in the honor of John Paulding by the city of New York. And John Paulding's remains are buried here, so it is a solemn place. John Paulding had a reputation as being an extremely brave man, fearless, to the point of recklessness, some would say. A good example of his bravery would be an incident that occurred near what is now Kycut Mansion on the Rockefeller estate. He and his fellow soldiers were garrisoned over there, and they noticed some British soldiers toward Tarrytown. Now, John Paulding wanted to go attack them, but his fellow soldiers wanted no part of it whatsoever. But in true John Paulding fashion, he picked up his musket and he went on the attack. He narrowly escaped that. He did not always escape, though, and he was taken prisoner and brought into Manhattan at one point during the war. In an earlier episode, we talked about a blue coat that Marioness Willett had confiscated near Peekskill. He brought that coat up to central New York, and it was cut up and used to form one of the first American flags, and that flag flew over Fort Stanwix. Now, in true John Paulding fashion, he wound up escaping from his capture in Manhattan. During that escape, he confiscated a horse as well as a green Hessian jacket, and he worked his way over to New Jersey, where he was captured by the Continentals because he was wearing a Hessian or enemy jacket. Now, fortunately, his life was spared because he ran into Pierre Van Cortlandt. Now, Pierre Van Cortlandt was the first master of Cortlandt Lodge No. 34, and he recognized John Paulding from the area. Who knew that in the future years they would become lodge brothers? So that green jacket would play another role in the capture of John André. Because when André was riding through Westchester County and he saw the three men, John Paulding was wearing that green jacket, and André recognized it immediately as the coat of a Hessian soldier. So André assumed that the three men were on his side, and he identified himself as a British officer, which was a huge mistake, and it sealed his fate. Because back in the rule of law back then, if you were behind enemy lines wearing civilian clothes as an enemy combatant, you were considered a spy, and the punishment for that was death. And this was not without precedent. Everyone knows the story about Nathan Hale being executed and stating on the gallows, "I regret that I have but one life to give for my country." So the Americans were somewhat forced into executing John André, and this is unfortunate because everyone seemed to like John André, including George Washington, but what could they do? We return to Verplank Point in the northwestern corner of Westchester County, not far from Peekskill. Now, this was an extremely important portion of the Hudson River during the American Revolution. It was also known as King's Ferry. And there were boats that would be going back and forth between here and Stony Point, ferrying people and goods between this side of the Hudson River and the rest of what is now our country. It was here that George Washington was camped out quite often during the American Revolution, especially toward the end. Now, it was in the hills of Verplank's Point where George Washington made his encampment. And it was right here in this spot that George Washington honored John Paulding, David Williams, and Isaac Van Wart by giving them each a set of pistols. That was in recognition for the contribution they made by capturing John André. In the final weeks of the war, John Paulding was once again captured and injured in a conflict between his unit and none other than Colonel James Delancey and his Cowboys, which were officially known as Delancey's Rangers. He was taken prisoner, brought down to Morrisania in the Bronx, and then down to what is today Roosevelt Island. At the time, it was known as Blackwell's Island, but he was a very famous person at this time. So he was ferried over to Manhattan, where he wined and dined with British soldiers and led out a fairly comfortable end of the American Revolution. Right along Route 9A, the very busy Route 9A in the Elmsford area, just south of 287 and Tarrytown Road, rests the old Dutch church and its cemetery. And right in the center of the cemetery is the monument to Isaac Van Wart. Just south of the cemetery is Van Wart Street, named in his honor. You will find throughout Westchester County there are a number of street signs of Paulding, Van Wart, and Williams, and it was all in the honor of these three men. John Paulding actually has a school named after him up in Cold Spring and a fire department across the river in Spark Hill. Now, while all three of these men were greatly celebrated in their day, from the time that John André was captured well after the American Revolution, In 1817, John Paulding would apply for an increase in his pension because the cost of living had gone up, and things had shifted quite dramatically in the halls of Congress. Whereas at one time, they represented the Jeffersonian ideal of the citizen soldier, the average everyday farmer running his affairs and running the affairs of his country. This was in direct opposition to the more Hamiltonian philosophy of those who were the big landholders, those who owned the big enterprises, the educated, the wealthy, controlling things. And this was so opposite of what the American Revolution was about, because the Hamiltonian philosophy is far closer to what the British Empire was prior to the American Revolution. All three of these men were not wealthy. They were all farmers. By 1817, when John Paulding applied for an increase in his pension, things had shifted dramatically in the halls of Congress. They had shifted much more to the Hamiltonian side. As a result, unfortunately for them, all three of these men their reputations were run through the mud by such likes as Benjamin Talmadge. They were called ruffians, and several historians have mislabeled them as Skinners. Now, the Skinners were a group very similar to Delancey's Cowboys. They got their name because it said that if they raided you, you would be left with nothing but the skin on your back. However, this was a mistake, a mistake that many historians have made through the years. The Skinners were actually on the Loyalist side, and if you look into it, you will discover that I'm correct on this. So these men were they were average farmers, citizen soldiers. For a moment, let's explore the concept of divine providence when it comes to this story. The first example would be the fact that John Paulding was able to escape from Manhattan. The second would be the fact that he, along his escape route, came across this green Hessian coat. The third would be the fact that Pierre Van Cortlandt just happened to be in the same spot where John Paulding was captured at that time, because they were nowhere near Peekskill at the time. The next, and I think most important example of divine providence, was the fact that John Paulding was wearing that same green jacket the day that they ran into John André, because this caused John André a level of comfort where he identified himself as a British officer immediately, taking these three men to be friendlies to him. The importance of the capture of John André in no way can be overstated, because if you remember from prior episodes, the grand strategy of the British was to control the Hudson River. Now, André that day was carrying detailed plans of West Point that were given to him by the one who must not be named. Had André been successful and gotten back to British lines, there is no doubt that they would have been able to take West Point, which was such a key fortification, keeping control of the Hudson River for the Continentals. Now, control of the Hudson River was the whole story here. It's what the Siege of Fort Stanwix was about. It was what the Battle of Saratoga was about. And the fact that John Paulding and that green jacket saved control of the Hudson River also saved the American cause. Now, there was an attempt made to save John André's life. George Washington wanted to exchange the one who must not be named for John André. Apparently, George Washington had grown quite fond of John André in the short period of time that he got to know him. John André is said to have resembled Marquis de Lafayette. They were both around the same age, both of French ancestry, and everyone knows the relationship between George Washington and Marquis de Lafayette was like father and son, and they were like lifelong friends. So it's only natural, given what we know about John André's personality, as he was said that everyone liked him, that there was a bond formed there. So when the response from the British was no way were they going to exchange the one who must not be named, they felt that they had to execute John André, and it was with much sadness that this was done. And when John André was standing on the gallows, his only request was that he be remembered for dying a soldier's death bravely. John André was buried here in Paing, New York. His remains were disinterred in 1821, and he was shipped over to England, where he was reinterred and buried in Westminster Abbey. If you know anything about Westminster Abbey, you know that it's quite a prestigious place to have been buried. That just goes to show what the British people thought of John André and him being a hero. Now keep in mind, John André never intended to be behind the lines in civilian clothes. That was a last-ditch effort on the part of the one who must not be named, and it could almost be seen as a betrayal by him. Just would not want to be one of his friends. So on exiting this cemetery today, I came across this tombstone. It's of Solomon Utter. I have no idea who Solomon Utter was, but one thing that caught my eye is that he served under Colonel Lamb, Colonel John Lamb. John Lamb, the son of liberty from earlier in our story. Also the John Lamb that was at West Point when George Washington went to look for the one who must not be named. Was Solomon Utter there that day? We'll never know, but that's one of the things I love about visiting these old historic sites. You just never know what you're going to discover.